Welcome everyone. The growth of South Australia may have been temporarily disrupted by COVID-19, but as of yesterday, I think we were at day 16 of no new cases. And there's a certain positivity being felt in South Australia, I think, about the easing of restrictions and SA entering a new recovery phase. Welcome to the second of our future Adelaide discussion panels, thanks to advertiser.com.au in partnership with the Government of South Australia. Today we're talking about infrastructure. And to help us dissect that are our three expert panellists. Welcome Diane Dixon, State Project Lead for Innovation Precinct Lot 14. Di was recruited from Queensland and has 2 decades of experience in overseeing the development of infrastructure, innovation and mixed use developments here in Australia and the UK. Welcome Di.
Thank you, good morning.
Good morning. Daniel Gannon also joins us. Daniel is Property Council Australia's SA Executive Director. Prior to this role, he worked as a Senior Media Advisor to then Opposition Leader Stephen Marshall and as a Corporate Affairs Consultant with the SA Cricket Association. Welcome, Daniel. And our third guest is Jeremy Conway. Jeremy is the Chief Executive of Infrastructure SA, where he was responsible for producing the state's first 20-year infrastructure strategy, as well as providing advice to the government on infrastructure projects and prioritisation. Thanks all for joining us today. I might kick off with you, Jeremy. How important are infrastructure projects in getting our state moving again?
Yeah, thanks, Kara. Vitally important, both from generating the economic activity and the jobs to help us recover, but also to make sure that we're positioning South Australia to be stronger, more resilient, more vibrant, and really speak to the positivity of what lays ahead of South Australia, really.
And what do you think, I'll throw this open to the whole panel, are the key projects that we need to get going for the state? Daniel, I might get you to kick us off. Daniel? Okay, we're having tech issues, I think, with Daniel.
I'm happy to jump in.
Go for it, Di.
Well, obviously, I'm always going to be slightly biased towards Lot 14, but coming from a broader infrastructure background, and in particular, how do we link particular areas of economic activity, particularly during these sort of times, around fast tracking and accelerating projects. I think for South Australia, there's a real need to prioritise the areas that are going to focus on building our business capability, getting the workforce back into play, and really not just focused around jobs, but focused around the infrastructure, hard and soft, that's going to deliver on that. And that's where things like talking of particular precincts, Lot 14 being one of several in South Australia, looking at how you actually utilise those to focus on the industries. So at Lot 14 around space, defence, artificial intelligence and technologies. So what are the ways that we can work smarter? And we've all learned a lot about digital technologies and telecommunications through the recent environment, and going forward looking at how we can actually focus on the use of those applications. So 5G, for example, and I'm sure Jeremy can jump in here as well, in terms of having a cohesive telecommunications digital plan and having the projects that are going to be able to facilitate businesses to grow. And that's where 5G at somewhere like Lot 14 will really provide the opportunity for those businesses to use that to grow themselves, but also put us on the world stage in terms of how we're using the next wave of new technologies to actually be globally competitive. So it's having smart infrastructure. So infrastructure is key to kickstart the economy, but it's those specific projects that are really going to drive that long-term sustained economic to future-proof us going forward.
Jeremy, agree with that?
Yeah, I'd echo pretty much everything Di said there. Digital infrastructure is going to be critically important for South Australia going forward to make sure that we can really capture those opportunities. Precincts such as Lot 14, as well as things like Tonsley, Tech Park and the like in Adelaide, they will be real drivers of economic activity going forward. So ensuring that they have the suitable digital connectivity and capabilities. The demands for data are growing at something like 20 to 30% per year. So the need for the digital infrastructure to support that is really fundamentally important. When you talk about digital connectivity, though, I think it's important to not only focus on those innovation precincts, but also recognise that in the regions there's a need to try and improve the connectivity out there. That's not only to give them the opportunity to capture some of these economic opportunities, but there's also a social equity issue there. Through this COVID environment, the uptake of telehealth and those sort of more innovative service delivery models has been really important. And to some extent, they're almost more relevant out in the region. So it's really important that regional South Australia has that digital infrastructure to enable those sorts of new business models, service delivery models, online learning to give equal opportunity across South Australia.
And where are we at with that digital infrastructure? How quickly can we, be getting how quickly can we fast track that kind of project?
Yeah, so I think we have some really good examples, and so things like the Gig City projects within Adelaide, connecting the innovation precincts to gigabit speed is really impressive. That's been rolled out to Mount Gambier and Whyalla as well. Education has a contract with Telstra around what's called the SWIFT project, where 514 schools in South Australia have been connected to high-speed fibre broadband. That's a great opportunity for us to leverage some of that key backbone in the digital infrastructure. But the reality is that there are gaps there, and so we're going through a process now as part of the COVID recovery team, trying to identify where those gaps are and what's the most efficient way to try and.
So to both of you, and just to let our audience know, we've lost Daniel Gannon due to a little technical issue, but we're trying to get him back. But has the effect of the pandemic resulted in any existing projects needing to be assessed, for example, put on the back burner or altered in scope?
Well, in relation to Lot 14, it was a good opportunity to reassess. We're sort of coming into the second wave of development in terms of hard infrastructure delivery. So it was a good time to relook at. We've nearly completed all of the heritage building refurbishment and got that activated to about 70% at the moment in terms of tenancy and business activation. And now the next wave is part of the city deal. So for us, it was a way of looking at where there may be opportunities to accelerate and bring projects forward. And that's really where we've been looking, and we've actually been able to bring one of the key projects, the Entrepreneur and Innovation Centre, which is one of the flagship projects within the Adelaide City deal, and our centrepiece within Lot 14. And we've actually accelerated the delivery of that to hopefully start construction early next year, which is probably about a year ahead of what we were scheduled. So it's been opportunistic in a way to look at things in a slightly different way, look at how we can deliver them maybe more innovatively, so that we could bring them to market a bit quicker, and then also how we can actually support the contractors. We have about 500 contractors on site every day at the moment, but how can we actually maintain that to help keep the momentum going at precincts like Lot 14, but also bring those projects that are future thinking ones forward in the programming of works.
And I guess
I'll touch on that as well, if you don't mind, Kara. So the government has a pretty expansive capital works program. So it's about $12.9 billion over the next 4 years. I think what's really important is that governments continue to invest through this time. It's important to give confidence to the industry that government's committed to the projects. But obviously, the world's changing pretty fast, and so we need to look at what are the priority projects to go forward, and look to what extent some things can be brought forward. Infrastructure South Australia is a very big advocate to really ramp up some of the asset maintenance investment across the government portfolio, which is a very quick and efficient way to get work into the market and dispersed across the state. But it's also recognising that we need to try and identify those projects that really enable us to leverage and capture the economic development opportunities going forward to position Australia well. So I'm committed to the current program, but it's about identifying what are the opportunities to really leverage, capture the best chance for South Australia to recover stronger and better.
Daniel, are you back with us? Can you hear us? No, not quite, not yet. Obviously, we can't do everything at once. Job creating projects the priority when it comes to infrastructure, or are there other drivers in this recovery?
Well, obviously the key one for everybody is around the economy, and that obviously drives everyone's lifestyles and the ability to facilitate other pieces of infrastructure within the region. But I suppose for places like Lot 14, that's the value of them in terms of trying to create neighbourhoods. So yes, it is about creating the jobs, but it's also about creating the environments that are going to be addressing some of those social, community, wellbeing and health requirements, and that whole inclusivity. So the job creation is critical, but it's also more about what other things are our offerings. So I can obviously talk from Lot 14, but more generically, it would be valid around looking at things like our international education market and how we're looking at that going forward, and obviously taking a very a review of how we approach that, but also looking at some of the infrastructure that we can deliver to support that. And Lot 14 will have the International Centre for Food, Hospitality and Tourism, which will start construction over the next year. That'll then be in place in a couple of years' time, which will hopefully be where we can then take real advantage of the ability of South Australia to be providing that sort of safe environment for education and promoting itself back onto that stage. There's also the cultural drivers around how we look at our cultural offerings, which then link into tourism and international visitation. So they're kind of all interlinked because all of them involve that job creation, but there's got to be those drivers for that realm, and that's where it's challenging, particularly for people like Jeremy, in terms of what are those priorities and how do we actually make sure we're delivering something for everybody, but it's something that's self-sustaining and of that long-term value.
Yeah, I'd agree with that as well. Jobs are obviously key at the moment in ensuring that we have that economic activity. But the COVID epidemic not only has created an economic issue to manage, but there's also going to be some social and community wellbeing issues that we need to work through. And so some of the infrastructure projects, particularly in the social infrastructure space, are going to be very important, not only to create the activity and jobs while they're being constructed, but also leave a legacy that helps support the community. And kind of building on Di's point as well, I think another really important aspect for South Australia and particularly Adelaide going forward is leveraging how well we've done through the COVID pandemic and position Adelaide particularly as globally as a safe, good place to visit, do business, study. And so I think positioning Adelaide and making sure it's as attractive and as vibrant as possible is going to be very important for the economic future of South Australia going forward. And so that not only is going to be good in terms of attracting new economic opportunities for South Australia, but leaves a legacy of a more attractive, vibrant city for everyone as well, which I think is very important.
Let's talk about that confidence. South Australia has fared very well through this. As I said at the start, we're I think day 16 of no new cases and has handled it well. How do you think the general public is feeling? I mean, a lot of people have lost their jobs. A lot of people have had jobs put on hold, but there is a sense of that we're hitting that road to recovery. Is that the feeling you're getting from speaking to people? Both in your offices and out in the community, that we are sort of going back into this with quite a positive attitude? I'll throw to you, Daniel, if you can hear us. And we can't hear you.
I mean, from Lot 14's perspective, it's obviously there was that initial period when people were working from home. It was a transition of that activity and the momentum dropping off, while also the construction work was maintained and some parts were accelerated. So that was continuing. But particularly over the last couple of weeks, with ourselves all coming back into the offices and in those sort of environments, I mean, from that perspective, just walking between the administration building and to Lot 14 in terms of the CBD and the vitality there. And I think, but within Lot 14, like the startup hub that Stone and Chalk are operating, that there's been, I would say, it's probably about 70% returned, and you can feel the vibrancy, and people have just taken on board what they now need to do in terms of some of the precautions that we're all having to take, but taking it on in a very good-natured way. And we've all had to learn to adapt to dealing through means like this and Teams and Zoom, but people I think are ready now for that face-to-face interaction and just even that ad hoc conversation that we've all been missing out on, which is where a lot of the valuable information sharing occurs, and being able to relook at what we're doing and prioritising, but also generating just that the value of people-to-people interaction, which is so critical, I think, both at a community level, but also at an economic and a vibrancy level within precincts in particular.
Yeah, I think we're seeing people really starting to look forward to coming out of the restrictions. The fact that we've opened up the regions for regional tourism, I think, has been really positive. That's been a great opportunity for some of the regions, particularly when some of them have suffered from bushfires or long-term droughts. To be able to get the people to go back to those regions now is really important for their own activity as well, and building confidence in those areas. And so, as Di says, just the increasing vibrancy and activity around the city as well is good to see, and it's a good measure of confidence. And, I think South Australians deserve to be confident and content with the way how we've managed this crisis. I think we've all had to pitch in, and I think we've done a great job. And it's something that I think we should all be very proud of.
And with these projects that we're looking at and looking to fast track, well, how do we move fast on these projects while still ensuring a push to use local supplies, workforce and talent? Jeremy, I might throw that one to you to start.
Yeah, sure. So there's going to be a big interest, I think, globally around looking at the security of some of your global supply chains. The reality is, so far, at least in the construction space, the supply chains have held up pretty well so far. We've obviously had a lot of the early issues around the health and medical supplies, which has been addressed now, but supply chains locally are holding up pretty well, and a lot of the more smaller, medium scale projects are something that the Australian industry and market's really quite capable of delivering internally within our state borders. I think when you get some of the larger scale projects and some of the more technical, specific engineering skills, some of that you require different skills being imported in. But I think the industry has done a good job in terms of keeping going through the crisis. We haven't seen a huge slowdown from government-funded projects. There's been a bit of a slowdown in the private sector investment through the time, but the industry coped quite well through this and has capability to take on more, I think. So the important thing when you look to try and fast-track projects is infrastructure projects are often complicated and risky, so you've got to make sure that you put the appropriate time into planning and understanding and addressing those risks. There are things we can do to try and fast-track approvals, make procurement more efficient and simpler, but we've got to make sure that we still put the rigour into that planning so we don't encounter risks that were unknown throughout the project. This is why trying to fast track some of those maintenance projects or smaller scale projects require less planning and less risk management are the important things in the short term to keep activity going.
I'm gonna throw to a question from one of our viewers or listeners at the moment, Norman Heckenberg. He says, why are there currently no major shovel-ready projects like they have in other states? Apart from the north-south motorway, which is still in the investigations phase, there seems to be no movement on other potential projects, such as the electrification of the rest of the railway network, a CBD underground rail connection via the East End, and an expanded tram network.
I guess I'll try and address that one. So shovel-ready project is a phase that often gets called out in these sorts of times, and to some extent is a little bit of a misnomer in terms of what is a shovel-ready project, because if it was really shovel-ready, it would have already started. There is still a fair amount of activity going on. We're in the process of electrifying the train line up to Gawler at the moment. You can't necessarily shut the whole train system down at once, and so you need to be able to stage these things in a logical sequence, and so we need to complete that project, I think, before we start shutting down other train lines to allow their electrification. But there's a big program of works on the go at the moment. But as I said earlier, it's important that for future projects coming online, that the necessary planning work's done. So we understand both that we're prioritising the right projects, but we're also suitably addressing all the risks that might be inherent in the projects that we're doing. So part of what ISA is doing is working with all the government agencies to making sure that they're pumping out those business cases and addressing all the issues that are required to make sure that we can invest in confidence that we're using taxpayers' money efficiently and investing in the right things.
How reliant is our state on both federal funding and private sector investment to rebuild?
I might jump in just from a Lot 14 perspective. And obviously any of these sort of economic zones or hubs or districts that are created around the world to really add value to the fabric of communities and also that sort of broader ecosystem of economic sustainability and job creation. But it's always got to be a very clear balance, and government obviously plays a very key role in that sort of strategic planning level, identifying where those requirements are and what projects should be focused on. And something like Lot 14 probably demonstrates that particularly well, and is one of the very significant reasons that I was attracted to come here from interstate and overseas originally, in terms of the planning that's been undertaken and the commitment that's been made through government. And then along with the Adelaide City deal, there's 650 million committed to Lot 14 in terms of creating the neighbourhood that's going to be of value to the local, national and international communities. But without having that government stepping up and being very strategic in their thinking and making a commitment, you're unable to then unlock that significant private sector investment, which is where we're now getting into the stage with Lot 14 of being able to leverage that work that's been done to date and the very rapid transformation of Lot 14, because it now becomes very attractive to the private market to come in as partners and to really significantly invest in the next phase of growth. So things like the Entrepreneur and Innovation Centre, which is going to be a significant build in the centre, which is going to be delivered through the private component of the market, but also the International Centre for Food, Hospitality and Tourism Studies. But then the next wave, which will come after that with the demand that we're already generating through tenants in those key sectors. So again, it goes back to governments having that strategic intent around their industry sectors that have strengths. So in this instance, very much defence, space, cyber, the application of technologies in the creative industries, and how do you pull all those together? And the amount of interest that we're now getting from tenants who are willing to make commitments for significant occupancy within some of these new buildings that have yet to be delivered, that's really enabled us then to package this up for the private market. So it's that balance and sequencing of getting both government and private investment together to really drive outcomes which will then be sustainable going forward.
And Di, has that private investment slowed down at all due to COVID, or are they ready to step in?
No, interestingly, we haven't seen that slow down for the specific Lot 14 projects. I think this probably touches on what Jeremy was saying, because there'd been so much rigour today and planning. We were in the stage of going, and so what we've just been able to do is approach the market to test that, because because we've got that pre-commitment interest as well from tenants and the ability that's been delivered through the City Deal partnership. We're actually able to give that confidence. And so I think it may be probably slightly unique in this environment that it's still got that confidence around it. But I think it's been that foresight beforehand and having a very strong leadership to drive precincts like Lot 14 that we're able now to reap the benefits. That wouldn't necessarily be consistent across the marketplace, and we'll likely see some of those tenants maybe fall by, but others will come up through the process of that planning. So it's not necessarily been something that's been obvious straight up.
My view on that is there's still a lot of capital out in the markets at the moment, but they're probably a little bit more circumspect than what they were, and a little bit more risk averse. And so the projects that do have a good business case before them, are well planned, have some demonstrated demand behind them, the capital markets are still looking for opportunities to invest. And so projects like Lot 14 are well positioned there to leverage it. In terms of the actual question you asked, I would almost put another spin on it. Instead of saying how reliant South Australia is on whether it's private or Commonwealth funding, it's really about looking at, well, what are the opportunities we have to leverage it? I think that's the more positive spin on it. Yes, we need private sector investment, but that's a good thing. We should be looking for more private sector investment. So I think it's put in a different spin. There's opportunities available in South Australia to try and attract that.
I'm going to throw to another question from one of our viewers, Monica Cordiff Gonzalez. I hope I've said that right, Monica. We need more small, well-equipped theatres, performance spaces and concert halls for our artists to play. And not just infrastructure, but the funding to activate these spaces. It's more of a statement, but is it one you agree with, or do we have enough theatres and spaces here?
Well, so the government last year released its arts and culture plan, which was produced through a fairly comprehensive consultation process to try and identify what the needs were. And I think through that process, it was identified there's need to investigate a concert hall, which the government's doing some work at looking at the potential for that, as well as what was called a small black box theatre, which is a more flexible space for those smaller sort of productions. So again, I think some more investigation work's done as to what that might look like. Those sorts of facilities are really important to add to the vibrancy and culture of Adelaide. Again, it's one of the other things, the Arts and Culture Plan looked at some of the key arts and culture facilities out in the regions, and so it's not just an Adelaide thing. I think everyone needs to be able to access those sort of cultural events and opportunities to either express themselves or go and enjoy that. So yes, I think there's a need for some more, and some of the work's been done to what that might look like going forward.
And I don't think there's any doubt that that's one of the sectors in terms of performers and, you know, artists that have probably taken quite a hard hit during the last few months, not being able to, you know, go and throw a concert at a pub, etc. So I think you know, Monica's got a good point. We need to support those people, just like we're supporting, you know, our small businesses, and help them move through this tricky time. How can we strengthen our health infrastructure to make us better equipped to deal with future potential pandemics or other major challenges?
Okay, I'll start off on that if that's okay. So I think South Australia has obviously done an incredible job in terms of managing the health issues around COVID. But one of the things that it has demonstrated is the important role around telehealth and using that sort of digital enabled technology to be able to serve the needs of the population in a good way. I think we've very rapidly invested and strengthened some of those systems to enable that. But that's something that's been clearly identified for an area that's going to need continued investment. Make sure that we can provide those services out in the regions, and they have the digital capability and infrastructure to support that. The speed in which SA Health was able to open up new hospital bed capacity, either in the ECH facility or the old Wakefield Hospital, there's some great flexibility in terms of how the public health system's able to contract with the private sector to support capacity and peak demands. And so some of that flexibility in terms of how the public system can work with the private system, I think is very important. But also that digital health aspect, I think, is going to be fundamentally important in any future pandemics or health crisis that we might have, to enable us to be able to respond to it in a quick, efficient and safe way, I think is vitally important.
And I think also from the Innovation Hub ecosystem that South Australia has, and is really a valuable and quite unique component of a state's infrastructure in itself, has lent itself to how we deal with pandemics as well, and I think has driven a much more closer relationship, or for those who are significantly involved in each of those precincts, actually getting together to talk about how we can link those hubs. So in particular, most recently, ourselves at Lot 14 and Biomed City and Tonsley, and looking at how our occupants or our focus and our strategic areas can come together to work more collaboratively, which is where unique solutions are created in terms of the collision of disciplines that wouldn't naturally come together. So the crossover in the world of AI, genomics, for example, and space as well. So in terms of how they can link into that health serving sector, and then also obviously through Tonsley around some of the manufacturing that's occurring there. So I think the infrastructure that we have in place is starting to be used a lot more, I suppose, in terms creatively, in terms of looking at problems and addressing them with solutions in a different approach.
And we have some great examples. So down in Tonsley, you've got MicroX making those small lightweight X-rays, which has seen some huge increase in global demand for their products to support efforts around the world. Some of the work that Sam Ritu is doing around the research for vaccines and things like that. Some great examples I think South Australia should be proud of in terms of how we're contributing to the global effort around the response to the pandemic, and how quickly some of the companies like Detmold managed to retool, be able to manufacture face masks and things like that. Shows a lot of the ingenuity, I think, within South Australian industry that we should be proud of.
I know none of us have a crystal ball, but is another pandemic something that we need to be very ready for? Is this a one-off, or is this something I think the world needs to be ready for, and therefore we need to be ready for it?
I think we're all conscious that we now need to be ready for it. Our worlds have changed forever, and we have a very different perspective on some of these things now. And I think that's where that I think, and Jeremy may have mentioned it earlier, around looking at self-sufficiency and how we can actually generate and focus on things that are required, that we don't have that over-reliance on other markets going forward. That's obviously going to have some levels of restrictions in the real world in terms of being able to grow a lot of our industries and their capabilities. But it's getting that balance right as well about how we can actually address some of those shortfalls that have become obvious through the current experience, and address those in a way that's of broader benefits than addressing a pandemic. It's also building new business, building new workplaces, and building new communities.
I've just heard the word that Dan might be back, but I can't see him, so we'll struggle on. And we will try and get Daniel Gannon back in the conversation if we can. So South Australia has just released its 20-year infrastructure plan. Could you expand on some of those key initiatives and what they mean for everyday South Australians? So the jobs and how this will affect the community in South Australia.
Yeah, sure. So important to recognise that it's a 20-year strategy, so it's a long-term document. So some of the things will play out over time, but some of the key themes that I think are really relevant for people today to appreciate and understand are things like the importance that we place around digital infrastructure. Obviously, the time through COVID, everyone on Zoom and Teams and things like that has shown how important that really is for your day-to-day living. So rolling out that to make sure that everyone across South Australia, including the regions, has those opportunities, how we can be well prepared to embrace your new technologies like 5G or greater uptake of nano low orbit satellites. Those sorts of issues are really important. I think it's also really important to understand how Adelaide as a city needs to function over the next 20 years. Our road network has served us pretty well, but I think people probably now, outside of the COVID time, when people have stayed off the road, are starting to recognise there's more and more congestion. The nature of the road network in Adelaide, it has a lot of traffic lighted intersections, which naturally slows down traffic. The average speed on arterial roads in Adelaide is about half the average across the other major cities in Australia, just because we are so traffic light dependent. And so we're very keen to see more free-flowing road network. So once the north-south corridor is completed, you'll be able to travel 80 kilometres without a single traffic light in the way. Again, I guess COVID's raised some concerns around public transport, but I think a greater uptake and an efficient public transport network. We have incredibly low patronage on public transport in Adelaide, and so it's important to see that play a greater role, so there's better connectivity between some of these economic precincts within Adelaide, reduces congestion and often leads to a more vibrant, livable sort of city. So the way how Adelaide itself functions as a city, I think, is a very important thing that people will see change over time. And beyond that, one of the things that we clearly recognise is just how fundamentally important water is for everything that we do in South Australia. And the part of that is efficiency in terms of how we manage our water resources for human consumption, but also the economic use. And so providing opportunities for our wine growing region to have more secure water supplies, really advocating for a clear and consistent and equitable national approach to the way how we treat the Murray. Those sorts of things I think are really fundamentally important for South Australians going forward over the next 10 years.
Talking of roadworks, and look, we often say that in South Australia, but there are roadworks everywhere at the moment. Is that councils and governments trying to, get those jobs done while the roads are a bit quieter? Is there a reason why there's such an influx? I can't get out of my street at the moment because there's laying bitumen, etc.
Yeah, well, I think there's probably some truth to that. There was at least a 40% reduction of traffic on the roads during COVID, and so it was probably seen as a good time to try and do some of that essential maintenance. The important thing that ISA has recognised is the need for these sort of programs to be properly integrated. There's nothing more frustrating than seeing a road be ripped up because SA Water's come into a pipe, and then a month later SAPN comes in and rips up the same road. Those sorts of issues. And so it's really important that the programs are integrated so they cause as little disruption as possible for people. But I think you're probably right. There's been some effort from all road managers, whether they're local government or state government, to take the opportunity of the decreased traffic on the road to try and do some of that essential maintenance.
And that certainly was happening, Jeremy. Along Green Hill Road last year, I think there was, it was ripped up, some pipe work was done, and then it was ripped up again a month later. So it's good to hear that we might start working together a bit better to make sure that doesn't happen. Yeah. I think we might have Daniel Gannon back. Daniel, can you hear us?
I can.
Yay! How you going? Look, I'm going to give you a chance. I'm going to throw back to one of our earlier questions. To you, Daniel, to say how important are infrastructure projects, do you think, in getting our state moving again?
Putting to one side the digital infrastructure that I might be able to access in my office and focusing on the more productive stuff. Look, construction plays a really important role in South Australia's economy, mainly because it's a massive jobs multiplier. So the property sector in this state is the biggest private sector employer. There's almost 170,000 people employed both directly and indirectly. When you have a look at the superannuation story, there's more than 1 million people whose superannuation funds are directly connected to major property assets in South Australia. 1 in 5 salaries and wages come from property and construction. So that's the economic underpinning that I think sets the scene for the story about the role that construction can play over the next 12 months, but also over the next 5 years. Because ideally, when we look back in 5 years' time and we think about the experience that was COVID-19, yes, there was the great health response, and we are, nation leading, world leading when it comes to the way that the government has handled the pandemic. But we have an incredible opportunity now to embrace the construction and development story. Again, when you look back in 5 years' time, we should be able to look at the skyline that was filled with cranes, hard hats, steel caps, high-vis vests that transformed the CBD, but also transformed the suburb with the federal government's housing construction grants. There is an immense opportunity for government to leverage big balance sheets. They have access to ultra-low levels of debt that you and I don't have access to. There's a great opportunity for the government right now to literally put on its hard hat and start building, because currently we are the biggest private sector employer. And when we do look down the road, particularly toward the end of the year, when that jobs valley of death might potentially really be set upon us, if it's not for construction, then what else?
Jeremy, I might let you respond to that. Are we doing enough in terms of construction?
I think the government, as I said before, has a fairly full book for the Forward program. Part of its initial response was the $1 billion stimulus package, part of which included $120 million additional road funding. There was $24 million towards more education funding. But the reality is exactly how long and what the recovery from COVID is unknown at the moment. how deep the impact might be when things like the JobKeeper starts to wind down, and what that will look like on economic activity and jobs numbers. So I think the government needs to keep a close eye on these sorts of things and needs to be able to respond quickly. And as Daniel said, there's very good multipliers when you look at the construction activity, and it's one of the quick and efficient levers that government can pull to ensure that it can support the economy through that activity and jobs. At the moment, I think it's a bit of a watching brief to see what happens. And whilst we're doing that, making sure that we're working as efficiently as possible to pump out those projects that are already in the pipeline and need to get going to increase some of that activity.
Daniel, I'll throw back to you. What projects specifically do you think we need to be prioritising? And I apologise to our viewers that you get to stare at my face instead of Daniel's, but we have had a few technical issues this morning. We should be able to hear him though. So what projects do we need to prioritise?
Look, I think there's a great difference between social infrastructure and then the harder stuff like road and rail, the civil infrastructure. Again, back to that jobs multiplier, for every $1 million invested in social infrastructure, so think health, education, recreational centres, commercial activities, for every $1 million invested, there are 12 jobs created. Now, when we talk about road and rail, fewer than 4 jobs are created for every $1 million. So, again, the state government does have a great opportunity. Take a look at the Riverbank precinct, for example, and formerly mooted projects like Arena Plus, productive pieces of social infrastructure that would attract and draw people, investment, activity. I think that the state government needs to really embrace social infrastructure. I think Infrastructure SA and Jeremy and his team should probably also embrace social infrastructure, perhaps a little more than road and rail, to ensure that we are creating as many jobs as we can right now. And of course, we're in the stage of our economic challenge with COVID-19, where we need as many jobs as possible, as many sustained and meaningful jobs as possible, and that means social infrastructure. But then, dovetailing into this conversation about what brand South Australia is going to be projecting to the rest of the world moving forward, there's an immense opportunity for South Australia to project a brand of health, safety, resilience, draw people and investment in South Australia. There's the population growth story. Right now, Victoria grows by more people every 27 days than South Australia grows in an entire year. Well, there's a really easy opportunity for us now to start telling the rest of the world and the rest of the country what's safer, more resilient place to be in the entire world than South Australia moving forward, as long as, of course, they bring with them job-creating business opportunities. They bring with them their families, their knowledge base, to help grow South Australia's economy.
Di, I might go to you for the next one, carrying on from Daniel's point about population. We always have this argument about population, about young people leaving South Australia. Lot 14 is about innovation and creating jobs. What are we doing to boost that population, i.e. to get people to come here, but also to stop our young people from leaving South Australia and giving them the opportunities to excel in this state?
Sure, yeah, and coming from interstate, believe me, this is not a unique problem to South Australia, and equally that's why South Australia need to really step up, because it's a competitive environment out there in terms of people wanting to attract, particularly in the education space, but also the tourism space. But how do we actually look at creating the right jobs in the pipeline? So not only are we developing the right skills, but we're working with industry in terms of knowing what the skills are required, going right into the future in some of those areas that we don't even know are going to exist in a few years with the pace of technology change. So it's really about having to have an eye on what's required in terms of that skill base and working particularly with universities, but as I say, but keeping it real in terms of what industry are going to require. And that's where ecosystems like Lot 14 provide us with that environment to support both the emerging companies in those particular niche strengths that I've mentioned in terms of things like space and cyber and defence. SA is on the front foot of that and has a real opportunity to step up and take ownership of those niche components that it has the expertise in, and that's been really evident through companies like Myriota and Innovore Technologies that are now based at Lot 14. And that's actually then got to be alongside, though, our university providers that we have here, but we also have MIT now as a partner in the Living Lab component at Lot 14, and also bringing in headquarters like the Australian Space Agency, the SmartSat CRC. So it's getting that combination right so that we are attractive and exciting place for people to want to understand how they can get involved in these industries, but also be able to see how these homegrown industries have actually been able to grow here and stay here and be globally competitive and have a global marketplace, but maintain that location here. And location for a while became a bit not obsolete in terms of innovation ecosystems, but it became a bit of an added extra. People believe they could do everything anywhere, which they can, but you can't underestimate the value of having that on the ground geographic clustering of academics, researchers, startups, innovators to really all come together to solve problems. And that's where the entrepreneurship actually occurs and the commercialization of ideas, which then enables companies to grow. So you start creating that pipeline of people that are studying here currently in the right areas, can then have internships at any of our innovation hubs, including Lot 14, but then actually have the ability to believe in themselves or gain the skills to create their own companies or to join those companies and be exposed to the smaller homegrown companies, but also the next wave of what we hope to see at Lot 14 being those more global specific companies too. So working alongside CEOs of various different companies. So it's really about creating, again, as Daniel said, that soft infrastructure. The hard infrastructure is the foundation, but it's how you create, program, and bring everything together and have a really long-term vision about doing that right.
Is South Australia in a better position now than it was before COVID, or have we fallen behind because of that in that pursuit?
I think we've definitely got different challenges. I mean, we all know what's going on in the education sector, so there's things that we're having to work through, but again, it's about applying things in different ways. And also going back to, as I said, it actually opened up opportunities for a lot of our tenants at Lot 14 to come together to look at particular solutions that could assist with the pandemic recovery, but also how we work with other innovation hubs, particularly like Biomed City and Tonsley. So I think it's not necessarily slowed it down, it's just definitely changed it, and we've got to sort of reset where our priorities are, but it really shows the commitment that South Australia have made. So it's actually putting their line in the sand to say, these are the target sectors we have. We know we're globally competitive at. We know we've got the skill base here. We need to support them, retain them, but also grow them in a way that is going to become meaningful, both through its application in the education sector, the research sector, but also companies that are going to provide solutions across a range of sectors. And that's where industries like space are so exciting because of their applications across any sector.
Daniel, I might throw to you. We're in the middle of a big planning law review in South Australia. How has COVID affected those projects and the changes to our planning laws? And what are the next steps?
Well, the state government currently has the powers to call in development. Local governments and councils are being lazy and lethargic when it comes to assessing and then approving development applications. So we think that's a really sensible move from the Planning Minister because in our experience, a lot of local governments can be quite lazy in assessing applications. I spoke to someone recently in the residential space. From the time that it took them to lodge their application right through until it was approved in a metropolitan council, it took 6 months. Now, when you apply that to the development and investment space, if it's taking 6 months or more to assess and approve development applications, that investment is just going to walk away. If we keep treating investors and investment like this, then they'll find other jurisdictions that are actually welcoming of that type of job-creating investment. But look, that's been going on for a long time now. Of course, we have 68 councils in South Australia. 19 of them alone are in metropolitan Adelaide. When you have a look at Brisbane, they've got one major council, that is Brisbane City Council. That's essentially from Gawler all the way through to the coastline for Adelaide. That's a massive council. The speed of their assessment is a lot more advanced than what we have here in metropolitan Adelaide. So again, we would welcome and encourage the state government to continue calling in any developments from lethargic local governments And if any developers and investors are listening this morning, if you are getting frustrated by the lack of speed with your assessment, contact the Department for Planning, Transport and Infrastructure, because it hasn't been good enough to date. But in terms of COVID-19, when you look across the landscape at the moment, there have been a number of projects that have been put on ice. Now, that's mainly from a debt covenant perspective. Banks have taken a different look at certain projects in recent times. And let's not forget, when COVID-19 hit and a lot of tenants across South Australia couldn't pay their bills, they couldn't pay their rent, landlords had to come to the table to provide massive, significant rent reductions, if not 100% rent reduction for a period of 3 months, 6 months, even 12 months for some tenants. Now, that is the fair and equitable thing to do in some circumstances, but as a direct result, a lot of those landlords that did have a good, solid pipeline of future investments, they've had to put them on ice because they now don't have that revenue pipeline coming through to help create their own portfolio. So I think over the next 6 months, you will see a number of major developments that will be put on hold. That's obviously reflective of the economic downturn that we're currently in. It's really hard for landlords of retail precincts, for example, to secure pre-commitments for spaces when a lot of tenants can't even pay their rent right now. So there will be some pretty significant challenges in the short to medium term, and that's why it is important for the local, state and federal governments to leverage their balance sheets to embrace shovel-ready construction projects, development projects, to provide that sustained and meaningful pipeline of short to medium term work for a lot of workers in South Australia.
Thank you, Daniel. And that is the voice of Daniel Gannon. We are having technical issues with getting his video, so but that is the voice of Daniel Gannon. I might throw this open to all three of you as we start winding up this discussion. What do you see as the single most important thing to do to make South Australia resilient in the future? And how can everyday South Australians play a role?
I'm happy to jump in.
Anyone?
I'm happy to jump in. Again, the Commonwealth Government has put $25,000 worth of housing stimulus on the table. The state government is currently looking at how it might contribute and kick into a scheme like that. Naturally, there are some caveats. They're new builds, they're significant renovations over $150,000. You can't earn more than $125,000 or $200,000 as a couple. But if you do have a renovation in the pipeline, if you are considering building a new home, there's never been a better time to build a house in South Australia with interest rates down to 2.5%, with cash stimulus on the table from both state and federal governments. When we do look 5 and 10 years down the track, one day we might look back at this period and look at the way that our suburban skyline has changed, because there are new houses across metropolitan Adelaide and regional South Australia. But also, when you do build a new house, there are more than 40 trades and sub-trades that are engaged to build your house, from concreters to sparkies to carpenters to landscapers. That jobs multiplier in construction is significant. So again, there's never been a better time to build a new house in South Australia. Interest rates are 2.5%. But also, for the state government, they've really got to double down on deciding what our new brand is moving forward when we are pitching South Australia as an investment destination to investors abroad and interstate. Health, safety, resilience. Just this week, we saw Commercial and General and the state government announce a $500 million development for the Australian Bragg Centre, commonly referred to as SAMRI 2. North Terrace is our Eds and Meds precinct. This is the new marketable brand for South Australia, productive health infrastructure. And at a time when we're coming out of a global health pandemic, what better brand than one focused on Eds and Meds in what is quite a job-creating sector that is construction.
Di, I might throw to you. What do you think, or what do you see as the single most important thing to make us resilient in the future?
I think I would draw on what Daniel has just spoken about there, in particular about SA has its particular strengths, and every state is now focusing on the same things. How does it become more resilient? How does it stake its claim in the international market in a meaningful way that's going to protect it from future bust and boom cycles, which traditionally have been due to other things, but now we have this risk factor of pandemics, which, as I mentioned earlier, is on everyone's forefront of everyone's mind. So for me, it's about sticking very true to some of the strategic intent that's already in place with a lot of our things like our growth state plan, focus on our key industries, but it's then finding the niches within those to actually then build the hard infrastructure that was required to support them, but it's that soft infrastructure and the curation and programming of those so they're actually here for the longevity. There's legacy here that is actually able to be built on for the economy in the long term. So, and what can South Australians role be in that as well? And it's always a really hard thing for, it goes back to that branding, as Daniel just mentioned. How do we make our point of difference? What's our value proposition? But also for Lot 14, these sort of innovation and ideas, neighbourhoods, precincts, all the terminology that's used are always one of the best kept secrets by local and state governments and communities. And what we need to do is actually communicate really clearly so that we engage with the community in South Australia so they can actually act as ambassadors and carry the messaging that we all want to do to make us strong and resilient going forward, continue, not just within our neighbourhoods, but then more broadly, nationally and internationally.
Jeremy, I might throw to you to finish this off. We have almost reached our hour. What do you see as the most important thing to make us resilient?
Sure, thanks, Kara. I'll try to end on a fitting note, I guess. I'll echo Di and Daniel in that it's really important that we look at the South Australian brand and how we can really position ourselves globally, play to what our strengths are, but also look at the diversity and complexity in our economy. From an infrastructure point of view to the resilience, I think this is where the digital infrastructure is really key. When borders close, how does South Australia remain connected to the global community? It's through digital infrastructure, so that's why it's really important that that's continued to be invested in as the demands of data and digital infrastructure grow. And in terms of what we can do, it's to some extent playing on Daniel's point, South Australians should be confident and comfortable the way how we've addressed this. I think too often we downplay our own success. I think we've done an extraordinary job here. We have many great opportunities to really take South Australia forward coming out of COVID. And I think all South Australians should look to that and take some confidence out of that and continue to invest in their own state.
Thank you all for joining us today. It's been a great discussion and I could continue talking, but our hour is up. Thank you very much for joining us for Future Adelaide. Thanks to advertiser.com.au in partnership with the Government of South Australia. Thank you, Daniel Gannon, for joining us via audio. Jeremy Conway and Diane Dixon, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.